The Maroons represent what is possible. The Maroons represent what you can achieve when you set your minds to a task. The Maroons represent that we are all born kings and queens, that we are all born to be great, that we were never meant to be slaves, but that we are free people, and it is for us to claim our destiny.
Greetings world, this is Tribal Tea Talk. As usual, it is so wonderful to be in your company, and today we have a very special topic. We are going to be delving into the extremely controversial topic of Chief Richard Currie and the Maroons of the Cockpit country. We will be delving into his rise. How did he get into his position? How did he come into prominence in the media and to have so much national and international attention, as well as what are his assertions, and is he crazy, and are these assertions crazy? So sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride. One of the biggest questions that you may be having, viewers, is how did Chief Richard Currie come into everybody's attention and be in everybody's eye like this? Internationally, nationally, at your house, on the corner. How did he become such a hot topic? It's no secret. The entire world should know, especially those who have a deep interest in tribal matters, indigenous matters in Jamaica. It is no secret that for a long time the Accompong Maroon community has had deep issues concerning their leadership. These issues are a bit outside the scope of today's program, but putting it lightly, the youth rose up and the youth asserted themselves and said, no, now is the time, we need an election. Their leader had been in power one term already and was about to complete another term, and they were complaining mainly that they had seen no evidence of an election planning to be called. So the youth rose up and they demanded an election. It became a matter that had to be mediated by the political ombudsman, but in the end, they managed to agitate for a proper election, which, when that election took place, the voter turnout was historic. Never before had they reported that amount of voters coming from so many different Maroon districts throughout the Cockpit country.
We go to other news now. 5 persons are vying for the post of colonel in the Maroon village of Accompong in St. Elizabeth. Now, as you'll hear in this report from Cody and Barrett, the Cockpit country is a big ticket item in this election.
And it was in that election that Mr. Richard Currie received, I believe it was 681 votes. He won by a landslide. And that is the moment in February, February 2021, last year, that he became Chief Richard Currie. It is also no secret that he is the first Maroon chief in Jamaica to have a college degree. Before ascending to his position as chief, it is well known that he worked extensively in many top corporations in Jamaica for many years. He's a master at marketing from what our research shows, and he seemed to launch quite a few products at Red Stripe and quite a few other large companies. The fact of the matter is that this man was clearly equipped to do exactly what he did, and that was to bring Maroons into the 21st century almost overnight. After this election took place, this man didn't waste any time. He went about and he did many interviews, and the people were like, oh, wow, we had never seen any other Maroon chief so prominently. Almost every time we go on Instagram, we go on YouTube, there's some mention of him. Well, Tribal Tea Talk recognizes that it is the marketing prowess of the man Richard Currie that enabled this to happen. Even one very controversial YouTube vlogger said that it is clear that he is the most socially adept and astute politician in Jamaica. In other words, his public relations campaign was on point. This is what we feel at Tribal Tea Talk attributed to the rapid rise of Richard Currie as Chief Richard Currie. In analyzing Richard Currie's chiefly career a bit deeper, we at Tribal Tea Talk recognize that part of his prevalence rests in the things that he has said. So some people agree with some of what he has said, some people disagree with some of what he has said. So we need to now look at what are the main topics that he's been referring to, and we've narrowed them to 3.
His first point, Maroons are Aboriginal.
What does Aboriginal really mean? Let's find out.
Merriam-Webster says, Aboriginal means being the first or earliest known of its kind present in a region, or of or relating to the people who have been in a region from the earliest time, of or relating to the Aborigines. It then describes Aborigines as a member of the original people to inhabit an area, especially as contrasted with an invading or colonizing people.
So as I trotted along this path back to my roots to find out who I am, where I'm from, all of that, I'd love to share a personal story real quick. I met an elder, a man from Accompong, a real Maroon from Accompong. And I said to him, tell me something, elder. Where do the Maroons come from? Are they really related to the first people of Jamaica, who everybody call either Arawaks or Tainos? And he looked at me and he smiled, very sly smile, and he said, boy, you're learning things, man. But hear what happened. If you said Arawak and Taino to my grandfather, he wouldn't know what the hell you're talking about. If you said who were the first Maroons and who started the Maroon communities, he would say to you, Parati. And that name has been forever etched into my memory. Now that we are analyzing Chief Currie's main point of being Maroons being Aboriginal, let us find out some more about Parati. Dictionary of Jamaican language.
In this old dictionary of Jamaican language, Parati is defined as any of the inhabitants of a distinctive community at and near Parati Bay in southeast St. Elizabeth. It further says, this part is swampy and principally inhabited by mulattoes, Quateroons, and other castes, a poor but peaceable and industrious race who have long been settled here and live by fishing and breeding poultry. A martial man who had been shot at by a Parati brown man who lived there related the conversation I held. So we dug deeper and found what Rampini had to say, and Rampini says, in the great savannah of St. Elizabeth reside a curious colony of blacks whose origin has puzzled most travelers. They go by the name of Paratis and build their huts in the little clumps of bush with which the plain is dotted. They have no religion, no tradition, they are extremely shy and shun the society of or even intercourse with white men. From their long course here, their narrow almond-shaped eyes, not round and bull-eyed like those of the Negroes, and thin, well-chiseled, though broad, lobed nose, it is supposed that they are of Indian origin. Parchment is a common name amongst them, a word which contains the prefix para, which is also found in Parati. Although they marry out of their own tribe, such marriage are not liked amongst them. They form a curious and by no means uninteresting problem to the ethnologist.
The elder from Accompong also relayed to me that the Parati not only lived on the coast where they are very renowned for living, but they also lived up in the hills. And it was up in the hills and back in the bush of Cockpit country that they had their communities, that they accepted people who fled from the plantation and people who were brought on the coast. When it was said to me by the elder that when some ships arrive on the coast in Paratee Bay, where the Paratee lived, the Paratee would intercept the slavers' ships and take their cargo of people wherever they came from and carried them back into the hills, took care of them, nursed them back to health, and formed these strong fighting communities of people that we know as Maroons today.
So the history is quite compelling, but we dug deeper and found what modern science had to say. We found this DNA study which concluded and confirmed that the Accompong Maroons had maternal lineages from the island's first peoples and were therefore the island's Aborigines.
So we found quite a bit of evidence supporting Chief Currie's assertion that the Maroons are Aboriginal. We have the oral history, which was corroborated by historical texts of the time period in the 1700s to the 1800s. We have a very compelling DNA study. But the cherry on top of this point was at the height of everything that Chief Currie was going through with the government of Jamaica last year, in about August. Chief Lorenzo Sanford of the Kalinago people of Dominica came forward of his own volition and initiative, contacted the Jamaica Gleaner, and gave them an interview in which he suggested the Kalinago system of how they relate to their state government in Dominica would be a good way for the Maroons of Jamaica to do it and to put a stop to all of this. His main reason for taking this initiative upon himself, as he said, the Maroons of Jamaica and the Kalinago of Dominica share one common root and ancestry with the first people of Jamaica. So, topic number one, you can judge for yourself. Is he crazy? Is Chief Currie crazy? Or has he been telling the truth? So the second point that Chief Richard Currie has been making is that the Maroons own land and that the land that his set of Maroons own is the Cockpit country. Richard Currie has been very vocal in his defense of the ecology and the sanctity of the Cockpit country. And he has gone very far to make it very clear that he considered and his people consider mining in any part of the Cockpit country to be a gross violation of their rights as indigenous people, and a big point for all the people of Jamaica, a gross violation to the nature and the beauty and the water and all of these vital resources that the Cockpit country offers to Jamaican people. In the height of the confusion between Chief Currie and the government of Jamaica, the Minister of National Security, who happens to also be the Deputy Prime Minister, Dr. Horace Chang, decided to come out and make some very disparaging comments concerning Maroon land ownership that really caused Tribal Tea Talk to scratch their heads. Because we at Tribal Tea Talk, having been very much involved in the rights of indigenous people, knew that this was not the normal conversation or the normal utterances of the government of Jamaica. So let's go right into some very poignant documents.
Here we'll be reading a presentation by Senator the Honorable Mark Golding, Minister of Justice at the 6th Annual International Maroon Conference in 2014, where he discusses the importance of the legal recognition of Maroon rights. He spoke specifically to Maroon land rights when he said, "The rights of indigenous and tribal peoples regarding traditional lands are well established in international law and are increasingly being recognized in national laws and by national courts. The International Labour Organization Convention 169 concerning indigenous and tribal peoples in independent countries, which was adopted on the 21st of June 1989, entered into force on the 5th of September 1991, applies to good governance, rule of law, and human rights, which are among my priorities as Minister of Justice. These precepts are, I suggest, of importance in supporting the growth, development, and protection of the rights within the Maroon communities." The Senator further said, "The question of land rights has been an ongoing discussion between the government and the Maroons. Jamaica recognizes the rights of the Maroon communities to use land in accordance with their system of communal property. It may be necessary to establish mechanisms to give domestic legal effect to such rights in the national legal systems. The administration is open to dialogue with the Maroons to assess any issue that is of concern to you, whether legal, social, economic, or otherwise."
But the real bombshell is an exclusive piece of evidence, a document that we received from the Grandinani Cultural Group over in Moortown in the Rio Grande Valley that was established by the esteemed Major Charles Aarons, the culture bearer of the culture of the Maroons of the Rio Grande Valley. This document he received based on his continued dialogue with the tax administration of Jamaica. And this document he received directly from Ainsley Powell, the Commissioner General of the Tax Administration, Jamaica. Ainsley Powell recently received a great award for his renown in the tax matters of the nation. He is known as the taxman, the tax expert. This letter is from him, and it is signed directly by him in his own hand. Let's take a look.
We have reviewed your general comments regarding our position in the levying of assessment in our attempt to collect property tax that you have stated were levied on lands designated for indigenous people, hereinafter Maroon lands. You have also noted your specific request that the caption property be removed from the tax rolls by virtue of it being exempt from property tax. Property tax is a legal obligation which is grounded by way of statutes for persons who are in possession and or own property. It is a part of Tax Administration Jamaica's mandate to collect the property tax in conjunction with the Land Valuation Department that is tasked through the Land Valuation Act to map and levy assessments for all lands in Jamaica. The two primary statutes, the Property Tax Act and the aforementioned Land Valuation Act, have provisions that exempt certain parcels from assessment and the collection of taxes. Exemption for the Maroon lands are not expressly provided for within the said statutes. Notwithstanding, the treaties signed by the British in 1738 through legislative arrangement have endured and grant rights, ownership and possessory for Maroon lands. The Maroon lands are not exempt from taxes through those arrangements, but through other statutes and other treaties, some of which you have mentioned, and are deemed separate and exempt from the payment of taxes. The issue, however, is that the boundaries for what has been asserted by the Maroons as Maroon lands have not been firmly established and consequently have not been mapped by the Land Valuation Department for its clear identification. It is incumbent on the Maroons to establish the boundaries in order that the Land Valuation Department may have the relevant information to extricate those parcels from the annual assessment exercise. If extricated, the property tax amount will then not appear on the tax roll.
Wow, what what a document. I think now it is full time for Jamaican people to consider who really owns the cockpit country. And after seeing this kind of evidence, I think it's full time that Jamaicans consider throwing the full weight of their support behind the Maroons of the cockpit country and Chief Richard Currie in the protection of the nature and environment of the cockpit country, for the mere fact that it affects all of us. So the third and final point that we're going to touch on from Chief Richard Currie is by far the most controversial, and that is of the sovereignty of the Maroons. Are the Maroons sovereign? Well, at this point in time, Tribal Tea Talk must make it clear that the government of Jamaica does not recognize the sovereignty of the Maroons. However, we find that very strange because in two of the world's most powerful nations, definitely the most powerful nations in the Western Hemisphere, Canada and the United States, recognize tribal sovereignty, indigenous sovereignty within their national boundaries. So, being that the government of Jamaica does not think that Maroons, the indigenous people of Jamaica, deserve tribal sovereignty, let us look at what the United States and Canada say about tribal sovereignty.
Looking at what our relatives at the National Congress of American Indians in the United States are doing, they have here an overview. There are 574 federally recognized Indian nations, variously called tribes, nations, bands, pueblos, communities, and native villages in the United States. Approximately 229 of these ethnically, culturally, and linguistically diverse nations are located in Alaska. The other federally recognized tribes are located in 35 other states. Additionally, there are state-recognized tribes located throughout the United States recognized by their state governments. American Indians and Alaska Natives are members of the original indigenous peoples of North America. Tribal nations have been recognized as sovereign since their first interaction with European settlers. The United States continues to recognize this unique political status and relationship. The governmental status of tribal nation The governmental status of tribal nations is at the heart of nearly every issue that touches Indian country. Self-government is essential if tribal communities are to continue to protect their unique cultures and identities. Tribes have the inherent power to govern all matters involving their members, as well as a range of issues in Indian country. The essence of tribal sovereignty is the ability to govern and to protect and enhance the health, safety, and welfare of tribal citizens within tribal territory. Tribal governments maintain the power to determine their own governance structures and enforce laws through police departments and tribal courts. The governments exercise these inherent rights through the development of their distinct forms of government, determining citizenship, establishing civil and criminal laws for their nations, taxing, licensing, regulating, and maintaining and exercising the power to exclude wrongdoers from tribal lands. In addition, tribal governments are responsible for a broad range of governmental activities on tribal lands, including education, law enforcement, judicial systems, healthcare, environmental protection, natural resource management, and the development and maintenance of basic infrastructure such as housing, roads, bridges, sewers, public buildings, telecommunications, broadband and electrical services, and solid waste treatment and disposal. In speaking about Indigenous self-government, Canada says, Indigenous peoples practiced their own form of government for thousands of years before the arrival of European and other settlers in what is today Canada. These forms of government reflected the economic, social, and geographic diversity of Indigenous peoples, as well as their cultural practices and spiritual beliefs. Early partnerships between colonial governments with indigenous nations were forged through treaties, trade, and military alliances. Over many centuries, these relationships were eroded by successive laws, policies, and decisions that were based on a colonial and paternalistic approach. This includes the Indian Act, which was passed in 1876 and continues to determine how most First Nations in Canada are governed to this day. The Indian Act imposed a colonial governance system on First Nation communities where authority rested with the federal minister. Canada has now embarked on a journey of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. It is a necessary journey intended to address a long history of colonialism and the scars it has left. The goal is to renew the nation-to-nation, government-to-government, and Inuit-Crown relationships with Indigenous peoples. The Government of Canada is working in partnership with Indigenous peoples to undo federally imposed systems of governance and administration in favor of Indigenous control and delivery. Canada is working with Indigenous peoples to support them in their work to rebuild and reconstitute their nations, advance self-determination, and for First Nations, facilitate the transition away from the Indian Act and towards self-government. Self-government negotiations are one way to work together in partnership towards this goal and advance Indigenous self-determination, which is a fundamental Indigenous right and principle of international law, as set out in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, it's important to note that they further went on to say that because communities have different goals, negotiations will not result in a single model of self-government. Arrangements take many forms based on the different historical, cultural, political, and economic circumstances of the indigenous governments, regions, and communities involved. For example, Inuit land claim agreements have been signed in all 4 Inuit regions. These Inuit communities are pursuing their vision of self-determination under these agreements, and in some cases, through ongoing self-government negotiations. The Métis are also actively pursuing their own vision of self-determination through ongoing engagement with their citizens and through dialogue at recognition of rights and self-determination discussion tables with Canada. Self-government is part of the foundation for a renewed relationship and is a pathway to development and economic growth that generates benefits for Indigenous peoples.
So, there you have it. 2 of the region's most powerful nations having complete deference and respect for indigenous and tribal sovereignty. You know, when Jamaica was looking to embark on a journey towards a legal ganja industry, cannabis industry, the government sent representatives to the US and to Canada in order to see what they are doing. Tribal Tea Talk suggests that it may be wise for the government of Jamaica to do the same and to send representatives to the US and to Canada and to consult with them and to seek advice how tribal people, indigenous people, the first people of the land should be respected and should be honored. Notwithstanding all of this, the struggle continues. The struggle continues to ensure that our lands, this beautiful island that we now call Jamaica, stays beautiful, stays green, and stays a home for the people that it belongs to. We urge you now, people of Jamaica, to look deep within and to decide if this is the direction that you want the next 10 years, 20 years to go in. We need to get serious about our environment. We need to get serious about respect for each other. And we need to get serious about our history and identity before it is too late. This has been Tribal Tea Talk. It has been a pleasure as usual, and we hope that this presentation has been informative and opens your eyes to the truth.
All right, everyone. Thank you for listening and thank you for being with us thus far as we educate, stimulate, and motivate. Please hit the subscribe button, keep watching, keep in tune, and stay in touch.